So hello everyone, my name is Cristian Doña Rebeco, and I'm the director of UNO's Office of Latino and Latin American Studies, OYAS. I am also associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I would like to welcome you all to our virtual panel titled Migration and Borders that opens the Hostile Terrain 94 exhibit here in Omaha. The exhibit itself is available for you to visit in person and by appointment at Amplify Arts located in 1419 South 13th Street, Suite 103. A little bit about Hostile Terrain. Hostile Terrain 94 is a participatory art project sponsored and organized by the Undocumented Migration Project, a nonprofit research, art, education, media collective directed by anthropologist Jason De Leon. The exhibition is composed of close to 3,200 handwritten toe tags that represent migrants who have died trying to cross the Sonoran Desert of Arizona between the mid-1990s and 2019. These tags are geolocated on a wall map of the desert, showing the exact locations where remains were found. This installation will simultaneously take place at a large number of institutions, both nationally and globally, in 2020. I would like to thank the co-organizers of Hostile Terrain 94 Nebraska, our colleagues from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, for inviting us, OYAS, to participate in this poignant and important exhibition. I am joined today by Dr. Tomas Sanchez and by Dr. Laura Alexander. Dr. Sanchez is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and is a faculty member of the Office of Latino and Latin American Studies. Dr. Sanchez does research on ethnic identity formation and the incorporation of Latino immigrants to new destinations, places like Schuyler, Nebraska. His main teaching interests include Chicano and Latino studies, introduction to sociology, and race and ethnic relations. But he really just loves engaging students and teaching them how to learn. Sanchez states, "I have had numerous role models in my life who have instilled in me a love of learning, and I simply want to give that gift to others." Dr. Alexander is an assistant professor of religious studies with a specialty in religion and human rights. She's the first recipient of the Golston Family Community Chair in Human Rights at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Dr. Alexander received her PhD in religious ethics from the University of Virginia and her Master in Divinity and BA degrees from the University of Chicago. Prior to earning her graduate degrees, she participated in a 2-year-long service program teaching English in a small community in Thailand and working in refugee service in Minneapolis. In addition to religion and human rights, her areas of research and teaching include comparative religious ethics, religion and immigration, and religious thinking about just war and national sovereignty, especially in relation to the idea of the responsibility to protect. Each of us is going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. We'll get to them as soon as we're done with our presentations. My presentation, or what I'm going to talk about tonight, is about borders in general and borders in Latin America. Borders in general are a relatively new thing in the history of humanity. They originated in 1648 with the Westphalian Treaty that defined the contours of the nation's states in Europe. Borders in general are a tool for social interaction and for the exercise of power. They're a place of exchange. There's a place where on one side you use one set of rules, and then meters away you use another. They're a place of culture, right? In one place you speak Spanish, and in a few meters away you speak English, right? They are in themselves a social political construction. So they're legal, but they're not real, right? Before nation states, there were no borders. And today, in many places of the world, you cannot see a physical border between two countries. You can actually, in some places in Europe, You can sit in one bench on one side of a country and then move 2 meters and sit on the other, and that bench across without doing any legal crossing. And you'll be in 2 different countries that speak 2 different languages. And now they use the same coin, but they used to not to. Now, this is important because most of history, people moved between countries as freely as they can move within a country, right? Native Americans in the US, indigenous peoples in the rest of Latin America, they've been living here before the existence of borders. In fact, in the case of Latin America, national borders are just a part of our colonial past. Borders in Latin American countries were first delimited by the Spanish Empire. And after the independence, at the end of the colonial period, these nations decided to maintain in some way the same borders that the empire had placed upon us. So that is why we have the current borders. Now, obviously, there are conflicts. There still are places where these borders are not well delimited. And in the last war, or the last military conflict for border reasons in Latin America was in 1995, which is, for all purposes, yesterday in historical terms. Now, in Latin America itself, borders have always been considered places that are far away, especially from the capitals of the countries. They've been porous. They've been of little relevance until someone crosses, or an army or a soldier crosses to the other side without asking for permissions. And where it's really difficult to maintain a presence. You need to think that borders in Latin America include the Amazon, where almost all countries in South America have a border with the Amazon. The only exceptions are the Guyanas, Chile, and Ecuador. Has the highest border crossing in the Americas. So at about 4,200 meters, that's about 13,800 feet, you can cross from Argentina to Chile. So the Andes is some way of a natural borders. You also have the Darien Jungle between Panama and Colombia. That is so thick that you cannot build a highway because the jungle itself eats it in a few days. Now, that particular border has been used recently by migrants from Venezuela and from other parts to cross from South America into Central America on their way to the US-Mexico border. So these borders are a place of integration, a place of contraband, and most recently, a place of securitization. You have to think that after 9/11, the triple border between, the triple frontier between Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay was deemed a dangerous place that probably housed an Al-Qaeda related organization in South America waiting to attack the US. So there are these places of unknown in some way or another. There are places of missing migrants and there are places of death as well. In the last 6 years, more than 3,600 people have died crossing the borders in the Americas. That is a minimum. We don't know the exact complete count. Of those, about 10% have been in borders not including the US-Mexico border. So there's been, I counted 23 deaths in South America, 653 in the Caribbean, and 611 in Central America. So it's not only in the US, it's the borders as a dangerous place for someone who's trying to escape oppression find a better life. It's a constant in the Americas, and in fact, in all the world, if you've been following the news about the Mediterranean Sea in the last 10 years. With COVID, most Latin American countries, and especially all South American countries, closed their borders at a time of extreme need, at a time that South America is a place of the largest migration and immigration flows of its history, the Venezuelan migration. Right? So we have an increasing number of Venezuelan migrants who are stuck in limbo between two countries without papers, without documentations, although the countries agreed to accept them until COVID-19. So they've been increasingly a place of security. It's a place where state actually use fear to control the other, that who's trying to enter. If you tell someone that you are now not allowed to enter a country through a delimited place, they will try to enter elsewhere. And I just read a few minutes ago that in fact a young woman died trying to enter Chile. A young woman, Venezuelan woman, died trying to enter Chile through the desert and the Andes. The U.S. has, as you all will know, the Mexico border, which is something that my colleagues will talk in a few minutes. But it's not the only place that the U.S. is involved in a border. The United States has, for the last 20 or so years, spent thousands and millions of dollars to increase the security in the Mexico Central America border as a way of moving the border away from the south border, right? So they have a buffer state that has become Mexico for many of these migrants. What is interesting is that, at least in some form, immigration, it's a human right. According to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in its Article 13, it states that everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. So it's a human right to move within the borders of your state. Now, it's also a human right to leave any country, including your own, and to return to your country. That's a human right. Never in any place in the Human Rights Declaration and in any other international agreement or convention of human rights says that entering another state is a human right. So it's odd. We're allowed to leave our country, but not enter another. So you're allowed to stay in a liminal place where you absolutely have no rights. But that liminal place, it's non-existent. It's a line in the sand. So is it really a human right to be able to leave? I've said several times in other occasions that this right, in the current conditions of forced or survival migration that we have in our world today, we have migrants escaping oppression, escaping terrorism, escaping hunger, etc. This human right is like having the right to escape from a building in flames, but only being allowed to stay in the sidewalk looking at that building. Thank you very much. I'll give the word now to Dr. Thomas Sanchez, who will talk for another 10 or so minutes.
Thanks, Christian. Welcome everybody, and thanks for spending your a few minutes with us this evening. It is a momentous evening, a momentous week, regardless of how things play out in the election. But I'm not here to talk about that. So the border with the US and Mexico, just to kind of bridge the two talks here, is 2,000 miles long. And so that's a lot of miles, and it goes through some rough territory, as we're learned from this exhibit, Hostile Terrain. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of Mexican immigration to the United States, and in the midst of that, talk about the history of the Border Patrol. So in 1848, Mexico and the United States, following the Mexican-American War, signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico basically forfeited about half of what was then its Northwest territory to the United States for $15 million. It became, what's now the Southwest United States. So what was needed when Mexico had this territory, there wasn't a lot of infrastructure there. There was about 80,000 people. I've heard estimates of 80 to 100,000 people, and it's probably closer to about 80,000 people. And if you've been, to this territory, it's this huge, wide open space. One of the reasons the United States wanted it is they wanted the land, but they didn't want the people. So they chose the place that had the fewest people, and that was what is now the Southwest United States. The Border Patrol started in 1924, and I'm going to go back a little bit, but I'm going to go back historically and talk about migration. But the Border Patrol started in 1924. I point that out because I hear people talking about terms which I'll only use a couple times here because I don't care for them, but terms like legal and illegal. And so I hear people say, my family came from wherever, Europe, Italy, in 18 whatever, but they came legally. Now, there was crossing the border without inspection, but the terms like legal and illegal were not used at that time. So they didn't come legally, at least the way that we think about it now. So between 1848 and about 1900, so more or less the second part of the 19th century, there wasn't a great deal of Mexican migration into what was now the new U.S. territory. It wasn't until after 1907 when the United States signed the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, and pretty much Asian migration here stopped. The whole thing about migration is the United States labor needs. That's why people came from Europe. That's why people came from Asia. That's why people come from Mexico. They come for jobs, and the United States needs that labor. So in 1907, by 1907, Asians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans a little bit later, Filipinos a little bit later, they became, kind of quote, undesirable. But the United States still had labor needs. So Mexicans started coming in higher numbers after 1907. In 1917, the World War II was already full force, even though the United States wasn't yet involved. It was in full force in Europe, so people were not coming from Europe. And the United States passed the Immigration Act of 1917, which further limited immigration from Europe. Now the U.S. has this huge labor needs. They need money to build up their war machine. They need money, and it's hard for me to say they or we because I wasn't alive then. So I'll continue saying they needed money to build up the infrastructure in what was now the Southwest United States, to build the roads and the dams and the more railroads and mines and stuff like that. So they started bringing over more labor from Mexico. At the same time, people from Mexico were fleeing the violence of the Mexican Revolution and the aftermath by 1917 of the Mexican Revolution. And so more people started coming in. The thing about Mexican migration, which makes it different from any other migration to the United States, is a number of things. One is the proximity, right? That Mexico is right there on our border. And because of that proximity and because of US labor needs, Mexicans have been coming more or less constantly since about 1900. 1907 is the year that's really used because that was when Japanese migration for labor purposes ended. But pretty much about 120 years, Mexicans have been coming constantly, including during the 30s when about 500,000 to 1 million people were deported. And then in the 1950s, they had, and here's a word I'm going to use, but it was called Operation Wetback. It shows you the lack of care that they had for any of these people, not just because the use of the derogatory term wetback, but also the use of operation as if it's some military operation, which in some ways it was. During Operation Wetback in the 1950s, over 1 million people were deported, and there was numerous reports of people being deported to Mexico, getting off the bus and seeing a recruitment station for the Bracero program, right, which was a guest worker program that was going on. So the United States was deporting people at the same time that it was bringing people over through this guest worker program. I'll give you a little example of some of the kind of just a personal history here. My grandfather came to the United States in 1914. He was 9 years old. He was born in 1905, so he was 9 years old, and he kind of came back and forth across the border numerous times until the Border Patrol started in 1924. Now he has this story from about, I'm not exactly sure when it is. My guess is it was about the 1950s, where he was in Mexico, and he was trying to come back into the United States somewhere along the Texas border, and they wouldn't let him cross. The people at the little crossing there, I don't know if it was the Border Patrol or Customs Enforcement, whatever it was, but they wouldn't let him cross. So he calls the farmer that he was working for. My grandfather's name was Presiliano, but people couldn't say Presiliano, so they called him Sam. So anyway, my grandfather calls this farmer, and the farmer says, "Sam, where are you? I need you to come, work in my fields." And my grandfather says, "I would like to, but they won't let me cross the border." The farmer says, "I'll be there in a couple hours." So, because the place wasn't right on the border. So he gets in his pickup, he drives to the border, he picks up my grandfather, and he brings him over. And I only tell that story because it points out the need for Mexican labor in the United States. And it also points out despite some legislation being passed in 1924 saying that Mexicans had to pay a head tax of $8 or that Mexicans had to pass a literacy test, all those rules and laws were ignored when the U.S. needed labor. And so while my grandfather couldn't pass by himself, when this white farmer went there to pick him up, saying, kind of almost like possession, right? Like kind of like, this is my Mexican, I'm taking him back over the border, which they did. But it shows the pull of US jobs in the United States, and that regulations can be subverted when the need arises, right? Most of the people that have been deported it was voluntary deportation. But people, kept coming back. One of the things with voluntary deportation is the people weren't officially given a trial, so they had less danger coming back and being caught again because they signed papers agreeing to be deported. All this migration and immigration, people didn't care too much about it. People meaning people in the United States, unless there was economic hardship, unless there was bad economic times like the Depression. During the Depression, the saying was that if we deport these Mexicans, it will free up jobs for Americans and the Depression will be over. And that didn't happen because there weren't that many people here at that time. The country, the Mexican population of the country in 1938 was only 2%. So it just wasn't that many people. I'm going to skip a bunch of years here and move forward to 1986 when we had the Immigration Reform and Control Act. It was kind of the last, not asylum, the word escapes me, but where people that are here that don't have papers are allowed to regularize themselves and become citizens. One of the stipulations of the IRCA, the 1986 Act, was that the border would close. They would close the border. Now, you can't close a 2,000-mile border, as we've seen. The current administration and past administrations have tried to do this, and people come over and goods still come over. But they did a good job and they stopped the flow. Meanwhile, the strawberry crop in California and pears and peaches in Washington state were literally rotting in the fields because they didn't have the labor. This is similar to things that have happened more recently in the last 2 or 3 years, where farmers can't get people to work in their fields, the people that they used to get, even guest workers. There is a guest worker program, but a lot of times people need the work like now, not in 6 months, which, it takes a long time for the bureaucracy to get this going. So there's problems with U.S. labor needs. Fast forward again to 1994, and we have the North American Free Trade Agreement, Nafta, which saw large numbers of people coming, again, mostly for U.S. labor needs, but also, just to give you one example, U.S. corn flooded the Mexican market in 1994. And so a lot of these small farmers, they weren't able to make a living, and they didn't come right to the United States. A lot of them moved to some of the cities in Mexico. They moved to Mexico City and Guadalajara and Monterrey, but they couldn't make a living there either because they were competing against all these other people going there. Eventually, they started coming to the United States. And this was, one of the last I say great migrations in terms of numbers, lasting from about 1993 until, probably until 9/11, probably till September 11, 2001, when people were coming in greater numbers. And this is also, more contemporary in terms of what we see now with large numbers of people coming, not just from Mexico now, but also from Central America. There's a theory, an idea about migration called push-pull, in which the push is negative things happening in the country they're coming from, and the pull is jobs or better things in the country they're going to. However, if the receiving country, if the pull country is in some ways manipulating the push, then it becomes pull, and eventually it just becomes pull. My point here is that Mexicans come here for jobs. If there weren't jobs, they wouldn't come here. There's no reason why anybody would go to Schuyler, Nebraska, not because there's anything wrong with Schuyler, but just because who's heard of Schuyler, Nebraska, unless there's a job there. So I'll just end here and let my colleague, Dr. Alexander, take over. But again, I just want to stress that people come here for better lives. All immigrants came here for a better life. But the reason that they come here is jobs, and the United States needs that labor. They need those people to come here and work.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez. And also thanks to Dr. Donia Reveco and to OYAS for organizing this event. And also, again, to my co-presenters, I always learn a lot from your work. And so I appreciate being able to present with you on this panel. So I'm also going to talk today about the US-Mexico border, and I'm actually focusing on the work of religious groups that provide humanitarian aid to immigrants at the border. So again, my colleagues have talked some about borders and about what's happening in general, both at borders kind of throughout the continents and also at the US-Mexico border. But I'm just going to sketch out some issues and some of the needs that religious and other humanitarian groups are responding to in their work. So over the last 25 years in particular, the US-Mexico border has become increasingly fortified and militarized. Again, Dr. Sanchez has talked a little bit about the Border Patrol, and even though Donald Trump has not succeeded in building that very much of that big, beautiful wall that he keeps talking about for years, the border does have close to 700 miles of either wall or fencing along it. There's also a virtual wall of surveillance to try to detect when people are crossing the border and then presumably to try to keep them out. Those barriers and the surveillance mechanisms are concentrated in more populated and areas that are easier to cross. So migrants who try to cross the border have increasingly been pushed towards the most dangerous areas that you can cross in. I mean, literally hostile terrain, as we're discussing in this exhibit and these series of events. Thousands more people are now migrating through the most remote and the most dangerous parts of the Sonoran Desert, which is along mostly the Arizona border. And at the same time that this is happening, several policies that have come out of the Trump administration have made conditions at the border much worse for migrants, many of whom are attempting to enter legally as asylum seekers. The so-called migrant protection protocols, which is also known as the Remain in Mexico policy, has led to the creation of what are basically refugee camps in towns in northern Mexico, since people aren't being allowed to enter the United States to file asylum claims as US law says that they should be able to do. These camps are subject to weather exposure. We saw that with Hurricane Hannah, which has left people, including babies and children, sleeping in mud, exposed to insects and to trash, and just really unsanitary conditions. Migrants in these camps are also exceedingly vulnerable to gang violence and kidnappings. Cartel members who think that a migrant might have relatives in the United States will target that person for kidnapping to try to get a ransom out of their relatives. The organization Doctors Without Borders put out a recent report finding that in 1 month, a full 75% of migrants who were waiting in the city of Nuevo Laredo had been abducted, and 45% had been subject to violence. I just found this today, and I looked it up again. This is Doctors Without Borders, so they have pretty good information. I sort of could hardly believe it, but I think these cartels are they're just there. Somebody walks down the street, they kind of grab them. It's a huge business for the cartels. So it's hard to get firm numbers on it, exactly why people are in the camps and kind of what they're coming for. But most of the people who are waiting in these, again, basically refugee camps for longer periods of time, seem to be people who are intending to seek asylum. And one reason I say that is just that folks who are coming up to the border who are intending to cross without inspection, Dr. Sanchez, to seek seasonal work, or to join family. Presumably, if you're coming and you know you want to cross without documentation or perhaps without going through a border checkpoint, you would just cross whenever you're ready. You wouldn't sit there and wait. Asylum seekers are in fact trying to get up to a border patrol station in order to announce themselves and seek asylum. And so many of those folks and those families will stay for longer in these camps. But then after enough time goes by without folks being allowed to kind of enter a border patrol station and announce themselves as asylum seekers, many of those families get desperate and they try to cross into the US without going through a border station. And some of you may know that this was exemplified in a really terrible and sad way when a few months ago that picture circulated of a man and his 23-month-old daughter who drowned in the Rio Grande while trying to cross over. So the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States has actually gone down since 2010. But again, whether people are intending to come in basically to seek work and they're just trying to find a place to cross, or whether they're planning to seek asylum and they kind of get forced into these dangerous crossings, many people are either swimming the river or crossing over in the desert to try to make it into the United States. So many religious groups are among multiple aid organizations that try to assist people in those camps in northern Mexico, also at the border when folks do cross, and then also in some of the harsher areas of the desert where the number of migrant deaths has been really high, hundreds every year at least. Organizations that provide aid include Catholic orders and social service agencies, Protestant groups really across the spectrum, mainline, evangelical, all kinds of Protestant groups. HIAS, which is a Jewish organization, and then also just multiple individual churches, synagogues, and mosques that are located in border towns. Many groups are also interreligious because multiple congregations have joined together to provide services more effectively. Those include organizations like Interfaith Welcome Coalition or Team Brownsville. Interfaith Welcome Coalition is kind of intentionally interreligious. Team Brownsville doesn't kind of announce itself as a religious organization, but it has a lot of folks who are involved with religious organizations who are working with that team. And those groups offer food to families in the US or in Mexico. Although, as you can imagine, a lot of their work in Mexico has been shut down right now because the border is pretty much closed, even to American citizens because of the pandemic. They also help, these groups I'm talking about, help to coordinate transportation. If people do arrive in a border town and they need to travel further into the United States to join family. They visit people who are in immigration detention as much as they're allowed to. And then they just provide basically for whatever needs they can, including spiritual needs. They do chaplaincy and hold religious services and so on for migrants. So most of these religious groups work within the bounds of the law, and they basically do what Border Patrol and ICE tell them that they can do. It's not always ideal for them, but they feel that it allows them to keep helping as many people as they possibly can. Where things have gotten interesting is in particular with the group called No More Deaths, whose volunteers leave food, water, socks, and similar necessities out in the Arizona desert for migrants who are making that journey through the desert. No More Deaths is affiliated with a Unitarian Universalist church in Tucson, Arizona, and most of its volunteers will say that they have a religious or spiritual motivation for providing aid to migrants. Because they work out in the desert like that, and also just because they've been more antagonistic with Border Patrol at times, No More Deaths tends to run into legal trouble more often than a lot of other humanitarian groups. So most recently, there have been 2 court cases where volunteers with No More Deaths were charged with violating the law. One of them involved 4 volunteers who were charged with misdemeanors for driving on a restricted access road without a permit, and for leaving water and food out in a wildlife refuge. They argued that their religious beliefs compelled them to go out and provide basic needs for migrants, and so they should be exempt from punishment for those actions. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in 1993. That act states that when people break the law because of religious motivations, the federal government has to apply strict scrutiny to their cases. And that means that the government has to show first that it has a compelling interest in enforcing whatever law they've broken. And secondly, it has to show that there is no less restrictive means of enforcing that law than whatever they're using. And if the government can't show those 2 things, then this act says that people should be allowed to continue with their religiously motivated activities. Within the last 10 years, my guess is that when you have heard about this Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it's been either in reference to the Hobby Lobby court case, which was about employer-provided insurance that paid for contraceptives, or possibly other cases that have to do with religious objections to same-sex marriage or reproductive issues. But of course, this act covers anyone who's acting for religious reasons. And so those volunteers were claiming that they should have the freedom to continue their work under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So those 4 volunteers were convicted in their first trial. And then in February 2020, under appeal, a judge held that the volunteers had been wrongfully convicted. And in fact, she said that they should have been exempt from punishment on religious freedom grounds. The judge wrote that the government does not have a sufficiently compelling interest in arresting and convicting people who leave out food and water to save lives. She noted that if she accepted this compelling interest claim, then the government would be admitting that they need and intend for migrants to die regularly in order for the government to be able to enforce that law. So then also within the last year and a half, there was one particular volunteer named Scott Warren who was charged with smuggling and harboring undocumented immigrants after he provided shelter at an aid station to 2 migrants who were suffering from exposure. Now, Warren also made a religious freedom claim. He was eventually acquitted, but actually his acquittal on the more serious charges, which were harboring and transporting undocumented immigrants, he was just acquitted. Basically, they said the government hadn't proved its case. He did succeed in having a charge of littering thrown out because it was dismissed on religious freedom grounds. And Dr. Sanchez is smiling, littering basically meaning that he had left water and food out. So that was being called littering on this wildlife refuge. So what's interesting here is that within the last 30 years, immigration laws and enforcement have become stricter, and yet there's also more legal deference to religious freedom claims. So you're starting to see some of these cases where people are saying, my religion actually obligates me to welcome and provide aid to immigrants, and I shouldn't be punished under any laws that would go against that obligation. So back in the 1980s, when the sanctuary movement was well known, there were clergy and others who were trying to make similar claims, but those claims at the time didn't succeed. And now those claims are succeeding more often. I haven't yet heard about any sanctuary churches making similar religious freedom claims at this point, but that possibility seems like it certainly would be there. So we may be seeing more of this kind of clash between some of this more harsh immigration enforcement and people making these types of religious freedom claims in the future. I'll stop there and would be happy to either answer questions or have a dialogue with my presenters, co-presenters.
Thanks, Dr. Alexander. Thanks, Dr. Sanchez, for those presentations. We open now for questions. Please write your questions in the chat box that we all panelists have access to them. And while we wait for questions from the attendees, I have a question for Dr. Sanchez, and that is, if you can tell us a little bit more detail what led to the development of Border Patrol as we know what it is today, because there's a increased presence and increased legality on the actions of the Border Patrol after 9/11, but that's not when the Border Patrol started, when ICE begun, but it's been going on for another 70 years before that. So can you tell us a little bit about why that became more important in the border crossings?
You mean like in the last 10 years or?
No, at the beginning, why there at some point the U.S. government decides to set up a militarized or of somewhat militarized force at the border.
Yeah. So when the Border Patrol first started in 1924, it was really small. I don't remember how many agents there were, but it was really small, and it didn't have very much money. One of the things that I read recently, that it said that it kind of shored up U.S. sovereignty, right? And you talked about the kind of the way that these borders and nation states are new, and so this helped kind of protect U.S. sovereignty. In terms of why it came up, so the Immigration Act of 1924, the Border Patrol it was a little bit different legislation. It wasn't created in the Immigration Act of 1924, but after the Immigration Act of 1924, the United States thought it had to have some way to control that labor, the Mexican labor. Again, the labor was needed, but so how do I say this? The people were not wanted, right? So the labor was needed, but the people were not wanted. So the Border Patrol was a way to try to facilitate. And I have a textbook in my class that talks about a faucet that's turned off and on, right? So you turn the faucet on and you allow people in when you need the labor. And then when the labor is no longer needed, such as during the Great Depression or other times when there's high unemployment in the United States, the Border Patrol comes in and then, helps deport people. Having said that, there's no correlation between unemployment and border crossings, right? So that this whole idea that people are coming here to take jobs, the research doesn't follow that, because we would think that if there's lower unemployment, that more people would be coming because there'd be more jobs available. And those two things don't mesh, they don't come together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's part of why the Border Patrol is formed, to be able to control, that to turn that faucet off and on. Mexicans kind of became this scapegoat in some ways. Before then, a lot of people that were formally deported, that went through formal deportation proceedings, were Asians, right? Japanese and Chinese. And there's some specific characters that they point to that when the Border Patrol started, they started deporting people to Mexico to show how efficient they could be. And then from there, it kind of like snowballed, it built on itself. The Border Patrol got more funds, they started deporting more people, they got more funds, they started deporting more people, and we kind of come to where we are today.
Thanks. Just remind me of a words that a Swiss clergy member said about the 1960s, when Northern Europe was receiving a large amount of labor migration of temporary workers due to the reconstruction after World War II. He said something, and I'm paraphrasing, we asked for workers, but we got human beings.
I thought of that too, actually, while you were on the same wavelength here.
Okay. So you can correct me if I said that wrong, Laura. So there's another question. There's a couple of more questions. Laura, you can probably answer this. What is the process for seeking asylum? Are there ways for it to be a more efficient process?
Yeah, so what's supposed to happen is that, as Dr. Donia mentioned, kind of right to movement, there's a right to seek asylum under persecution, and there is a right to enjoy, in quotes, asylum if you are in fact subject to persecution in your home country. There is no obligation for any particular country to provide asylum. So the way a country like the US, which historically has taken in some asylum seekers at least, sets up its process, is that if a person is on the territory of the US, anywhere on the territory, they can ask for asylum. And they can do that within 1 year of arriving on the territory, unless circumstances in their home country have changed. If you're here on a student visa for 2 years and then a civil war breaks out, you can ask for asylum at that time. You undergo what's called a credible fear hearing, where somebody basically sits with you and kind of asks you a few questions to try to just an initial hearing to ask what is it that you're afraid of, what's going on. And if that person determines that you do have a credible fear of some kind of violence or persecution, then your case goes into asylum court, where eventually you have a hearing with a judge, and that judge will determine whether you're granted asylum or not. The process in the US is kind of a mess. Whether you get asylum in the US or not really depends on what judge you go before, much more than it depends on your actual case. And the thing about what's going on at the border right now is that in principle, under the way that the US law is written, of course, people interpret different laws in different ways, but it looks like someone should be able to go up to the border and say, I am an asylum seeker, I request asylum. enter the US and their case begins. They might be detained at that point. They might go into the community at that point. The law doesn't really say, the law, part of the law that I'm familiar with doesn't say detention or no detention. But that person then would be in the US seeking their claim. What's basically happening now is that only very few people per day or per week are being allowed to even go up to the Border Patrol station and ask for asylum. And so that's why you have people living in camps who are just waiting to go up and make that initial ask. But that's sort of the way it should work. And in theory, if somebody has a reasonable claim, they should remain and they should be granted asylum. There's no cap that I'm aware of on the number of people who can be granted asylum in a given year. But the system is just very flawed, even without this issue at the border.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There's another question that probably for Dr. Sanchez. How do you think the border security will change throughout time? I have heard of people trying to cross from underground. Is that real?
Yeah, I think, and it was even before the current administration. I think it was during the George W. Bush administration. And if I remember correct, it was one of the California senators, I think it was Feinstein, said, if you build a 50-foot wall, somebody's going to build a 51-foot ladder, right? So this is why when I start off, the border is 2,000 miles long. And, you know, I'm sure that there's tunnels, you know, I mean, we kind of know about tunnels where they smuggle drugs and other things. And I'm sure that people are smuggled through there too, also just depending on how much money, you know, because people are making money doing this. And this wasn't always the case. You know, I've read instances of people who used what they call the coyote back in, even as recently as the 80s or 90s, when it was like a cousin or something, or they paid someone $50 or $100, and now it's a organized criminal organization, and they're charging thousands of dollars. And so for thousands of dollars, yeah, they'll build a tunnel. They'll try to get boats around where the wall ends in San Diego, over the fence, under the fence, and more importantly, through these areas that we're talking about today, where they trudge through the desert for days and weeks sometimes, and more people die.
If I might, I realized I kind of forgot to address that second question, which is about the efficiency of the asylum process. And the straightforward ways to make the asylum process more simple would be, first of all, just to stop what's happening at the border, to allow people to simply come in and ask, but also then you need more judges to hear the cases so that cases can go through more quickly. You need to make sure that you inform people about their cases, and that you kind of are careful about the amount of paperwork that you require for people to be able to try to prove. I mean, you know, the idea is that someone is proving that they're subject to violence, so often they're asked to bring in some paperwork, but sometimes it can be really onerous requirements. And in some ways, you know, from a philosophical perspective, the question is, are you setting up your asylum system to encourage people to seek asylum, or maybe somewhere in the middle to sort of do a process where you're trying to hear them in a fairly neutral way, or are you setting it up to try to discourage people from either seeking or gaining asylum? And I think our system has enough elements in it where we are trying to discourage people from seeking or gaining asylum that it has led to a lot of inefficiencies in the process.
Thank you. There's another question here that probably both of you can answer. Can any of you talk about the 550 children who are still being held within US camps? What are your viewpoints regarding the quote unquote policy of stripping children away from their parents?
You want to take it, Dr. Sanchez, or
No,
no,
it's not my area, no.
So I think those 550 children are ones whose parents have not been found to be reunited with them after they were separated. And I believe that those children are primarily either in foster care or some kind of a care facility. So those children are not in camps exactly. They're somewhere in the US. And for the most part, their parents have been deported. And so there's like volunteers as much as they can with the pandemic going through the streets of small towns in Central America trying to find parents of these kids. I mean, from a human rights perspective, families shouldn't be separated unless there's no other good way to accomplish something. So you would, the evils that you would do by that, if somebody is, if a family staying together for some reason would cause more harm to the child, you have abuse, you have criminality, something, than the family being apart, then that would be a justification for separating the family. Otherwise, if there's not something that would be more harmful to the child, psychological research as well as human rights documents would say that you need to keep families together. So I don't want to sort of belabor too much, but there is a court ruling that says that children cannot be held in immigration detention for more than, I think it's 20 days. And so what happened with that zero tolerance policy was that basically the government said, we're going to hold the parents for as long as we want to. And since we can't hold parents and children together because the children can't be held, we're going to take the children away from the parents. The way that if you don't want to do that, what you do is you just don't put people in detention. Basically, you say, okay, you have a court hearing, you can go live freely and then come back for your court hearing. 83% of asylum seekers come back for their court hearings. If they're provided with fairly minimal case management, 99% of asylum seekers come back for their court hearings. So that system seems to work okay. And I mean, basically that is the solution. If you don't want to see children and parents being separated, is just to allow families to live in the community while they're waiting for their cases to be heard.
And just to tag on that a little bit, because it seemed to parallel what was happening with hostile terrain, the whole purpose of this exhibit, that these are scare tactics to try to get people to not come, right? I mean, this was the thing that we know from when preparing the exhibit Hostile Terrain. There was a video that stated very clearly that the United States calculated that people would die crossing the desert, and they knew some people would die, and they said, well, you know what, some people would die, and then it'll get back to their sending communities and they'll stop coming. And that didn't happen. They kept coming, right? And the same thing I think is happening with these separating children. If we treat them, not necessarily separation, but if we treat them very roughly and treat them very be mean to them, for lack of a better word, that it'll get back and people will stop coming. And you know, I think the caravans have slowed, partly because of COVID, partly because of the $10 million plus that Christian talked about earlier that the United States gives to Mexico to try to reinforce its border with Central America. But you know, from what I could tell, not because like the conditions that people are fleeing are much worse than the conditions at the U.S. border, if that can be believed.
Dr. Donia, do you want us to try to fly through a few questions, or?
Yeah, actually, the last thing that you mentioned, Tom, there is one of my favorite poems recently is the poem Home by Schuyler, who is a refugee or children refugee in England. She's originally from, she's Somali from Kenyan parents. And the poem starts with saying that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. And that's basically what you mentioned there. I have, thank you, there's really, really interesting questions. Allegra asks, what Dr. Sanchez said about the pull of immigration happening now is very interesting. I'm wondering if you could speak more about the media messages and other enticing propaganda that the U.S. might be using to provoke immigration, although at the same time they're criminalizing it and making it more dangerous.
Yeah, so I haven't really researched or focused too much on media per se, but I do know that in the 90s and into the early 2000s, that corporations were actively recruiting in Mexico south of the border. When I was doing my dissertation research back in the mid to late 90s, I remember seeing this flyer, and I don't remember where it was even. I should have taken a picture of it, or at least I should have grabbed the flyer, but I should have at least taken a picture of it because it was. It had to have been in Mexico. I had to have been in Mexico because it was recruiting. It was telling people come to the United States to work. I'm not sure now with networks, with the way that things are set up, that recruiting is as necessary because, again, people come for jobs. And you know, when I did it was almost 20 years ago that I did my interviews in Schuyler, but you know, people talked about, you know, I would ask them, why did you come to Schuyler? Because my brother-in-law worked here, and he said that there was, you know, it's hard work, but it's decent pay and it's good work, and they liked Schuyler, right? I asked this couple from El Salvador, what do you like about Schuyler? And they said, porque esta calma, tranquilo, and you don't have to understand Spanish to understand. They're saying it's calm and it's peaceful here, right? So that's another reason people came. They came for work, and they came because they liked small places like Schuyler, these small rural towns where they were relatively peaceful.
Thanks. And piggybacking on that, there is another question for you, that if you can talk a little bit more about the Schuyler community and integration of immigrants in Nebraska.
Yeah, so Schuyler is interesting because the official census count, I can't remember what it was last I saw. I think the Hispanic population was in the 70s, right? So when I did my dissertation, I lived in Schuyler from 98 to 2000, and I did some interviews there in 2003 and 2004. And the, for lack of a better word, the native population, which really means, when I used to say that, people would think they were Native Americans, but I just mean the people that were born there, mostly the white population. Some of them were very welcoming. I remember the mayor, the mayor who just, he wasn't voted out. He just decided not to be mayor anymore, but he was mayor for like 25 years. And I remember him saying, if these people had not come to Schuyler, Schuyler would be a ghost town like a lot of the other towns around it. So a lot of people realized that they needed that economic stimulus that immigrants brought. Other peoples didn't like the immigrants so much. I remember hearing things like there's all like us and they and we and them kind of thing, but they ruined our town, and they talked about them almost like disease, like they're spreading and they're doing this and that. Interestingly enough, I've been to Schuyler recently to do some research on some other stuff, not really looking at immigration per se. And now when I did my research in Schuyler, it was really mostly, white people, white Americans, and then Latin American immigrants, people from all over Latin America, not just Mexico. Since then, in the last probably 10 years, there's now large numbers of African refugees, of Somalis and Sudanese in Schuyler. And I'm tempted to go back. I haven't done research there, but I've heard kind of musings from the Hispanic population against this new African population coming in. So it's like I've always said, whoever's there resents the new people coming in, regardless of how long they've been there, right? The people that were there in Schuyler before the Hispanics moved in were Germans and Czechs, and their ancestors came, 80 years ago or 70 years ago. But nonetheless, they hadn't been there that long. And then the Hispanics are there. I only use Hispanic because that's what the census uses. Hispanics have been there, for since 1990, so about 30 years. But they're already resentful of the new population moving in, and everybody's going there for work. There's a packing plant right near there, so everybody's going there for work. But it's interesting that I don't know that there's any like accepting, specifically in Schuyler, accepting of Latinos, because the majority of the town is Latino, right? And they're starting to get some formal power. There's now some city council member. I think there's one city council member and maybe a couple of school board members. So there's still what I call a great deal of not legal, but social apartheid, where the majority of the population is formally ruled by this minority population, but they're starting to get more integrated and starting to get more of that formal power, but still that resentment against the newcomers.
Dr. Donia, I understand if folks have to go. I can try to run through a few of these last questions in about 3 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
The question about criminality, there have been cartels and gangs operating in Mexico for a long time in various ways. Migrants have been preyed on for a long time by criminal gangs. The one difference at this point is that people are basically stuck in these camps. And so there's sort of more opportunity for people to get nabbed just because they're kind of stuck and they're not able to move. On the Q&A we had, when asylum seekers are accepted, what cities or towns are they directed to? And I think it's a little bit like what Dr. Sanchez is saying. It's sort of where the work is, where family is. So there's not really particular cities or towns. The government doesn't really tell them where to go. People at that point, when they have their asylum status, then they go where they think they can make a life, basically. Someone mentioned a book in the Q&A, The 3 U.S.-Mexico Border Wars, Drugs, Immigration, Homeland Security by Tony Payan. I haven't read that, so I'll be interested to take a look at that. Someone asked, if your asylum case is denied and you are deported, can you come back with a student visa? And I'm not sure. Yeah, I think not. I mean, you guys can weigh in here, because if your case is denied, you can appeal. I don't know if you could ever come back on a different status. If you're kind of forcibly deported, you're generally not supposed to come back. So I'll leave that in case our other panels want to weigh in. Someone asked if there were organized events to collectively search the deserts. I think that probably some of these aid groups do try to do some searching, but I don't know a whole lot about whether they actually organize events and what they do there. And then the question about children being detained is a good one, because yeah, there's discussion about like what's happening with child migrants. So these particular camps that I was talking about at the border are a creation of the MPP policy, which means those camps where a lot of people are living in the way that they are right now have only been around for a year. When did MPP start? A couple of years ago. I mean, migrants have always come to these border towns and sometimes stayed for a while. So that's always a few decades. So people have been in these towns, but these camps where people kind of have to stay is something of a new thing. In 2013 to 14, during the Obama administration, there was a surge of child migrants coming from Central America. I think researchers still are not totally sure why that happened right at that time. There seem to have been a few different factors. And so it was, whether it should have been or not, it was a surprise to the immigration authorities and the Obama administration at the time. So for a period of time, the child migrants who came up were held in some of these fenced-in detention centers while they were being processed. And it wasn't good. I think they should have worked harder to figure out a better way to hold the children. And then the children were kind of eventually went into foster care or like care facilities while their claims were being processed. So when you hear about or you see, discussions about children being held in these fenced-in facilities during the Obama administration, that had to do with the surge of unaccompanied child migrants for the most part. The Obama administration did not separate children from their families as a matter of course. They did look for whether there was abuse or something that would, a pretty strong justification for separation. Obama was called the deporter in chief by immigration advocates. He succeeded in deporting more migrants total and more migrants per year than the Trump administration. So the Trump administration has had some of these policies that seem to have a level of intentional cruelty to them in a way that has been new within the last few presidential administrations. But border security being more militarized and holding people in detention and trying to deport lots and lots of people is something that has been going on for a long time. So I'll see if my fellow panelists want to add anything on any of that.
Well, I would just add that the policy that led to hostile terrain was started in 1994 under the Clinton administration. So the Democrats and Republicans both have a lot of blame or credit, depending on which side of the situation you're looking at, for the situation and the history of the more recent history of what we've seen here.
So that's something that I wanted to point out, that even though there are specific actions within each government, the migration policy of the United States has been a state policy, not a government policy. Now, the Department of History and OAS faculty, Dr. Danielle Batiste, who is as attendee, she teaches a class on the history of immigration to the U.S. that if you're interested in Europe, in town, you should probably check out. It's a wonderful class. I think that we can do about one more question. How has the public charge language of the 19th century been recycled by the current administration? Tom?
Well, in fact, just was it yesterday or the day before, one of the courts nullified one of the new Trump administration rules that said if you get, I don't know exactly all the details or how it was worded, but if you get food stamps or anything else, this can be held against you in applying for a green card. And one of the federal courts just nullified that within the last day or two. So yeah, that has been, that's part of the rhetoric with the media and with anti-immigrant, advocates. And there's, sure, there's probably some people that have done this, but, for one thing, undocumented immigrants and immigrants in general are not eligible for, federal aid. A lot of the aid that they get, going back to Dr. Alexander's talk, is by religious organizations. But, partly through research and partly through my personal experience with talking to a lot of people, a lot of people, a lot of these immigrants, they won't take aid. They don't want to. They want to do it on their own. And sometimes I've had to try to talk people into, no, you deserve this. You're eligible for this. Please go apply. And they don't want to do that. Or they're very good at forming mutual aid societies, mutualistas, and helping each other, right? Pitching in to help each other. So yes, the public charge issue has come back up. This whole thing that immigrants are coming here for welfare, but the research hasn't proven that, hasn't pointed that out, hasn't shown that that's truthful. At the current administration's attempt to kind of solidify that and codify that seems to be, at least now, not working. Of course, there's probably going to be appeals, and who knows what will happen in the end with that.
One thing I can say is that the refugee program, when people are designated as refugees, they come to the US, they can receive 9 months, 8 to 9 months of aid, pretty minimal aid. And then folks are supposed to have a job by that time. If it's a family, they're eligible for kind of family aid up to whatever kind of time limit the state that they're in has put on that. So refugees particularly, they have that particular legal status, they get a certain amount of aid. And I guess that's one thing if we're talking about administrations. The Obama administration did attempt to continually increase the cap on the number of people who entered as refugees to the US. So I've been talking about asylum seekers from the border. These are folks who resettle. And most of you probably know the Trump administration has sent that number way down. And depending what happens tonight and in the next day, if there is a Biden administration, it appears that they would like to put that cap back up so that the US would be taking in more refugees. So that's another difference if we're just talking about executive administrations. I think the research isn't it? The economic research is that whether refugees, asylum seekers, or migrants for work, that migrants end up putting more money into the economy than they could ever possibly take in aid or different programs.
In fact, there's several.
The number that always stands out to me, now this is not undocumented, this is immigrants, all immigrants. And it's probably more now because this number is about 20 years old. It's $7 billion into Social Security every year, $7 billion. And I remember I was in a class one time, and the student said, you know, they were kind of, they were skeptics, which they should be, right? And they said, you know, where does that number come from? And I said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And all I did, I just Googled 7 billion. That's it. I didn't Google immigration, nothing. I Googled 7 billion and the research came up. So that's $7 billion, most of which they don't get back.
So with that, if there are not any more questions, I would like to thank all of you attendees and Dr. Sanchez and Dr. Alexander for participating in this opening panel outside. So thank you very much and have a wonderful night. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. Peace.